2:14 in the morning, three cameras go dark. Darius Whitmore, the night guard. Nobody in that building could even name has 6 minutes to stop $31 million from vanishing forever. He breaks every rule to do it, and he wins. By sunrise, the chief executive officer fires him in front of the entire company without watching 1 second of the footage. What she does not know is that Darius already copied the tape. What she really does not know is what he recognized the moment he saw it. Sterling Meridian Holdings occupied 38 floors of glass and steel in the heart of Atlanta, a private investment firm managing assets worth nearly $4 billion. The company was in the final stretch of acquiring a logistics firm, a deal that had consumed 9 months of negotiation, and $31 million sat temporarily in a corporate settlement account, waiting to be released to the company seller. On Monday morning, fewer than 8 senior executives knew the exact hour that release would happen. The firm's financial systems were marketed to clients and regulators alike as nearly impenetrable a fortress of encrypted approvals and layered authorizations. Nobody inside that building believed a breach was possible, and that confidence would nearly cost them everything. Darius Whitmore had worked the night shift there for 14 months, and in all that time, almost nobody had bothered to ask him a single question about himself. He was 42 years old, tall and quiet, with a uniform that was always pressed and shoes that were always polished. He arrived 15 minutes early to every shift, never touched his phone while patrolling, and never once dozed off during the long stretch between midnight and dawn. To the executives who rode the elevators past him, he was simply security, a word that flattened him into furniture. Some of them even called him by the wrong name, mistaking him for the guard who worked days, and Darius never corrected them. He only watched, and he watched more carefully than anyone in that building understood. Inside the security office, he did not just glance at cameras the way a bored employee might. He memorized the rhythm of the entire tower, who left which office at what hour, how long the elevator took from the 3rd floor to the executive suite on 31, which magnetic locks glitched on humid nights, which employees swiped their badge with their left hand instead of their right. He kept a small notebook, logging, timing, and anomalies the way another man might log a diary, and the head of security, a man named Travis Boone, once mocked him for it, saying he acted like he was guarding Fort Knox. Darius only answered that he was paid to notice what wasn't normal, and he meant it. The chief executive officer, Vanessa Holloway, was 47 years old and fiercely respected for her refusal to tolerate delay or excuse. She had built her reputation on precision, refusal to and reputation, on trusting titles, procedures, and hierarchy above all else. Vanessa was not the kind of executive who spoke down to people because of their skin, but she carried a quieter and more dangerous flaw. She measured a person's competence by the badge clipped to their chest, believing the chief financial officer understood money, the technology staff understood machines, the lawyers understood the law, and the security guard understood locked doors and little else. In 14 months, she had never once had a real conversation with Darius Whitmore. The night it began was a Sunday quiet, in the way most weekends were, the building nearly empty by 2 in the morning. Darius sat in the surveillance office with black coffee cooling beside him, watching 96 cameras cycle across the screens, a cleaning worker moving through the 12th floor, 2 technicians working late in the server room on the 5th. Only one person held clearance to the financial operations suite that night: the chief financial officer, Brett Callahan, and Darius had personally watched Brett's car pull out of the garage at 9:47 that evening. But at 2:11 in the morning, a security badge bearing the name Brett Callahan swiped through the reader on the 31st floor. Darius checked the time again, glanced back at the garage footage, and confirmed that Brett's car had never returned. He rose from his chair, and in that same instant, 3 of his monitors went black at once. He did not panic. He checked the power lines first, confirming there was no building-wide outage and no network failure severe enough to explain it. Only 3 cameras had gone dark: the hallway on the 31st floor, the door to the Treasury operations room, and the executive elevator designated number 4. And together those 3 cameras formed a single, unbroken path through the most sensitive part of the building, This was not an accident. Someone had constructed an invisible corridor, one camera at a time, and they had done it with precision that suggested they knew exactly where every lens was pointed. Darius called the remote technology desk and reached a technician named Gavin Mercer, who checked the system status and found something strange: that all three cameras still registered as fully online, despite showing nothing but darkness. That meant the video feed itself had been replaced, rather than disabled, a much harder trick to pull off. And when Darius asked whether someone might be running a looped playback, Gavin went quiet, because a guard should never have known that term at all. Gavin dug deeper and confirmed it. The cameras were replaying 47 seconds of old footage on an endless loop, disguised as a live feed. Company protocol was rigid about moments like this, requiring Darius to call the head of security, first wait for confirmation, and never lock down an executive floor without approval from someone above him. He called Travis Boone once, and there was no answer. He called a second time, and again there was silence on the other end. Darius looked at the clock, made his decision without waiting for a third attempt, and triggered a local lockdown of the entire 31st floor. Almost immediately, the emergency exit sensor on that floor detected motion, someone pulling hard against a door that would not open, and Darius used the building's intercom system to announce himself, asking whoever was inside to identify themselves. Nobody answered. 5 seconds later, the badge signal belonging to Brett Callahan reappeared, this time, swiping into the Treasury operations room itself, and Darius immediately noticed the contradiction sitting right in front of him. Someone had just tried desperately to escape the floor, and moments later that same identity was used to enter the most heavily protected room in the entire company. Gavin called back, sounding shaken, reporting that the financial system was in the process of executing an emergency payment order for $31 million, routed to an intermediary account registered in Delaware, authorized by 2 valid digital signatures, belonging to Brett Callahan and to Vanessa Holloway herself. But Vanessa was in New York that night, hundreds of miles away, and Darius asked the only question that mattered: whether the money had actually left the bank yet. Gavin told him the transfer window would open in less than 4 minutes, and something old and familiar stirred in the back of Darius's mind. A cold room surfaced in his memory, 6 monitors, columns of transaction data, an investigation from years earlier that had taught him a hard lesson about how theft like this really worked. It never required breaking a lock or hacking a firewall, only borrowing legitimate credentials and using them to perform an illegitimate act, a method with a name he hadn't spoken aloud in a long time. He whispered it to himself in the empty security office: credential laundering, and understood immediately that he had no legal authority to halt a financial transaction, but he did have authority over physical threats to the building's infrastructure. He triggered a protocol built for fires, sabotage, or physical breaches, one that would isolate the internal data center from every outside connection for up to 180 seconds. It was never designed to stop a bank transfer, but Darius used it anyway, severing the connection and freezing the payment in a state of pending authorization. Exactly 6 minutes after that first fraudulent badge swipe, $31 million remained untouched inside the company's account, and Darius called the police while the figure on the 31st floor vanished from the Dyson hallway entirely. He knew, though, that whoever it was had never actually left the building. When the police arrived, Darius expected them to find and question an intruder, but the first person to step out of the elevator on the 31st floor was the head of security himself, Travis Boone, who looked straight at Darius and told him flatly that he had just sabotaged the company's entire system. Travis took command of the scene immediately, claiming he had rushed in after receiving an automated alert and had ridden up on the service elevator to reach the floor faster. Darius noticed the flaw in that story instantly, because the service elevator's camera had never gone dark and there was no footage anywhere showing Travis riding it up. He tried to say so, but Travis spoke over him before he could finish the thought, redirecting the conversation toward procedure and protocol violations instead. By 3:05 in the morning, Brett Callahan arrived at the building, visibly furious, insisting that his access badge had never left his wallet the entire night and handing it over to police as proof. He suggested that Darius had simply misread an internal systems test, though nobody in the room could explain why a routine test would attempt to move $31 million out of the company. Travis asked Darius to step away from the control panel, and Gavin soon announced that the cameras had been restored to normal function, showing an empty hallway with no sign of intrusion or forced entry anywhere on the recording. Darius understood immediately that the footage had been swapped again, but he chose not to argue the point out loud in that moment. Before Travis fully regained control of the system, Darius had quietly removed a small storage device from a backup recorder, an independent 15-minute cache that ran separately from the main network, a redundancy that Travis did not appear to know existed. The next morning, Vanessa flew back from New York for an emergency meeting held at 8:30, and Darius arrived still in his uniform from the overnight shift, having been awake for more than 26 hours straight. Vanessa sat at the head of the table, with Brett on her right and Travis on her left, joined by the company's attorney, Renee Caldwell, while nobody from internal audit had been invited to attend at all. Travis presented his version first, describing how Darius had locked down an executive floor without authorization, severed a critical data connection, disrupted the payment system, and put a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars at risk of collapse. Brett insisted the $31 million order had simply been a pre-positioned transaction, nothing more than routine preparation, and when Vanessa asked directly whether any money had actually been lost, Brett answered that none had. In her mind, the story now seemed remarkably simple. A guard who panicked broke procedure and caused unnecessary chaos over nothing. Darius asked calmly for the raw local footage to be reviewed, but Travis replied that the security footage had already been reviewed in full. Darius corrected him quietly, saying that was not the footage he had personally witnessed, and Vanessa, with a board call scheduled in 20 minutes, grew impatient and cut through the exchange herself. She asked Darius directly whether he had activated the data isolation protocol without proper authorization, and he admitted that he had. She asked if he understood that doing so violated company policy, and again, he said yes, without hesitation or excuse. Vanessa made her decision on the spot, telling him that effective immediately, his employment with Sterling Meridian was terminated. Darius did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not plead for his job the way she may have expected him to. He removed his employee badge and set it gently on the conference table, then asked her one final question before turning to leave, whether she had actually watched the 6 minutes of footage herself. Vanessa answered only that the matter had been reviewed, and Darius told her plainly that had not been his question. The room fell silent, and when she offered no further response, he walked out. Inside the elevator, Darius reached into his jacket and removed a small storage drive, holding it in his palm as the doors closed around him, knowing it contained 6 minutes of footage no one in that building had bothered to see. His phone buzzed almost immediately, with a message from an unknown number warning him to delete the copy, reminding him that he had already lost his job and should not risk losing more. He did not reply. He powered the phone off, removed the SIM card entirely, and sealed the drive inside an anti-static pouch before leaving the building for what he assumed would be the last time. Darius lived alone in a modest apartment, with none of the luxury one might expect from a man who once operated at the center of federal financial investigations. A few photographs from his military years hung on the wall, and a framed certificate sat forgotten inside a closet, gathering dust, along with a cardboard box of old case files that Sterling Meridian had never once thought to ask him about. 11 years earlier, Darius had not been a security guard at all, but a fraud investigation specialist contracted through an interagency task force, an expert in what he called physical-digital breach correlation, tracing the exact links between physical access and electronic transactions. He had helped dismantle a scheme that stole $84 million from defense contractors, a network that never hacked a single firewall, instead cloning access credentials, blinding cameras, recruiting insiders, and executing transfers within impossibly narrow windows of time, almost identical to what had just happened at Sterling Meridian. He left that world after discovering that a supervisor wanted to delay an arrest in order to protect a confidential source, a delay that ultimately resulted in serious harm to a witness who never should have been left exposed. Darius spoke out against the decision, and though he was never charged with wrongdoing himself, his career quietly froze in place. Afterward, buried under politics, he refused to play. He walked away, entirely rejecting further investigative work, and years later chose the simplicity of a night security position, instead a job with no politics and no pressure to look away from what he witnessed. Sitting now in his apartment, he opened his laptop deliberately disconnected from any network and studied the 6 minutes of footage frame by frame with the same discipline he had once used on federal cases. The first camera had entered its loop at exactly 2, 10, and 51 seconds, but one single frame existed just before the loop began. A faint reflection caught in a glass door. The reflection showed a man whose face remained hidden, but on his wrist was a distinctive watch, square-faced, fitted with an unusual metal band that Darius was certain he had seen before, worn by one of the executives during a meeting, only days earlier. A second detail emerged when he examined the audio, since the microphone feed had never actually been altered, only the video. Beneath the looped footage, he could hear a door, the sound of uneven footsteps, and then a single quiet sentence spoken low enough that it had clearly not been meant for any recording. Boone said, "We had 9 minutes," the voice whispered, and Darius sat with that name for a long moment, turning it over in his mind. Boone. Travis Boone. He placed a call from a public payphone to Monica Greer, the company's head of internal audit, a woman who had once spoken with him briefly in an elevator months earlier, and unlike the other executives had actually remembered his name. Afterward, he asked her to check for any emergency transfers between $28 million and $32 million across the past 36 months, offering no further explanation. When she pressed him for a reason, he told her simply that the previous night had not been the first attempt, then ended the call before she could ask anything further. 2 hours later, Monica called of Vanessa Holloway herself. Vanessa was already buried in the fallout of the incident, fielding pressure from the board, while Brett quietly convinced her not to involve federal authorities, arguing that no money had actually been stolen and that any formal report could jeopardize the pending acquisition. Travis agreed with him, and Vanessa, exhausted and eager to move forward, accepted their reasoning without much resistance. But Darius's final question kept surfacing in her mind, uninvited, whether she had actually watched the 6 minutes herself, and eventually she gave in to the discomfort and logged into the security system on her own for the first time. She reviewed the official recording carefully, seeing nothing but an empty hallway, exactly as Travis had described, until she noticed one small inconsistency in the reflection of a digital clock displayed on a lobby monitor in the priv. Background. The timestamp jumped backward, from 2:11 and 17 seconds to 2:10 and 30, proving the footage had indeed been looped exactly as Darius had claimed. She called Travis directly, and he brushed off the discrepancy as a minor compression glitch in the recording software, an explanation that came almost too quickly and too smoothly for her comfort. Vanessa did not understand the technical details of camera systems deeply, but she understood something more fundamental, that people who lied often explained themselves faster than people telling the truth. Rather than confront him further, she quietly reached out to Gavin instead, and he confirmed everything, that the cameras had indeed been looped, that Darius had been the first person to notice, and that Darius alone had reacted quickly enough to stop the transfer before it completed. He added that if Darius had waited even 90 more seconds, the $31 million transfer likely would have gone through successfully. Vanessa asked why none of this had appeared in the official report, and Gavin admitted that Travis had instructed him to classify the entire incident simply as guard error. Vanessa pulled Darius's personnel file and found almost nothing useful, only a vague title of security officer and a note listing his previous employment as private consulting, since the standard background check had never surfaced his classified interagency work. She called Renee, who used a professional verification channel reserved for sensitive matters, and returned an hour later with a thin folder that she placed directly in front of Vanessa. "You didn't fire a security guard," Renee told her quietly, and Vanessa looked up at her without speaking. You fired a former financial breach investigator who once helped recover $68 million for the federal government. Renee continued, and the weight of that sentence settled over the room like a physical thing. Vanessa tried calling the number listed for Darius, only to find it disconnected, and when someone from the company was sent to his apartment, they found it already empty. She began to understand the full scale of what she was facing, because if Darius genuinely believed someone was watching him, then whatever conspiracy was unfolding ran far deeper than a single greedy chief financial officer acting alone. Monica came to her soon after with the full breakdown of the 7 transactions totaling $186.4 million. Funds carefully split across dozens of shell companies before eventually returning disguised as consulting fees, corporate loans, and inflated asset purchases. Vanessa stared at her own digital signature on documents she insisted she had never approved, and Monica told her plainly that someone had been using her identity for years without her knowledge. When Monica opened the 7th and final transaction dated 3 years earlier, the timestamp of approval read 2:14 in the morning, the exact same moment Darius had first detected the new theft in progress. They've been practicing the same 6-minute window for years, Monica said quietly, and Vanessa understood then that this was never a single crime but a system. Darius reached out to a former colleague named Wesley Grant, a federal investigator he had once worked beside, who was initially furious that Darius had disappeared from the field for so many years without a word. But the moment Wesley heard the number 31 million and the phrase credential laundering, his anger shifted immediately into focus. He explained that a single storage drive alone would never be enough to open a formal federal investigation, that they would need to establish clear intent, identify who stood to benefit, and prove the direct link between physical access credentials and the fraudulent transactions themselves. Together, they broke the 6 minutes down into 6 distinct stages. The cloned CFO badge used to establish false legitimacy, the looping of 3 specific cameras, the entry into treasury operations, the use of a duplicated executive, authentication token, the transmission of funds to an intermediary bank, and finally, the careful erasure of every trace before leaving the floor. This was a robbery without a single weapon, without a mask, without a broken lock, requiring nothing more than 6 precisely engineered minutes. Darius enlarged the reflected image of the wristwatch from the recording, and Wesley recognized it immediately as a limited production model with only 500 units ever manufactured worldwide. A photograph from a recent company event confirmed that Brett Callahan owned and regularly wore that exact model, but Darius refused to jump to conclusions too quickly. Considering the possibility that the watch had been deliberately exposed as a decoy to mislead anyone who later reviewed the footage, when he studied the audio more closely, he noticed the intruder's footsteps carried an uneven rhythm, a slight drag on the right foot with every other step, a pattern that did not match Brett's normal gait at all. Darius remembered instead that Travis Boone had suffered a serious knee injury years earlier during a training accident, and recalled the exact same uneven rhythm in the way Travis descended stairwells during routine patrols. The man who had been trapped on the 31st floor that night was Travis, not Brett, though Travis alone lacked the financial system access required to initiate a wire transfer of that size. Travis controlled cameras and physical doors, but held no authority over the financial platform, while Brett controlled the financial system, but had no ability to manipulate surveillance footage on his own. The 2 men needed each other completely, and Darius put it simply to Wesley, explaining that what they were dealing with was not a lone thief, but a partnership built on complementary access. Wesley asked the obvious next question: how anyone had managed to forge Vanessa's own digital signature across 7 separate transactions, and Darius identified the one department capable of maintaining and issuing executive authentication tokens. The man responsible for that system was Colton Pierce, completing a group of exactly 3 conspirators: Brett controlling the money, Travis controlling security, and Colton controlling the very tokens that made Vanessa's identity usable as a weapon against her own company. Their current evidence was strong enough to raise serious suspicion, but nowhere near strong enough to expose the entire network in a courtroom So Darius proposed manufacturing an entirely new target to draw the conspirators out. He designed a fabricated transaction worth $44 million internally labeled as a confidential payment tied to the ongoing acquisition visible only to the three suspects through three separate and distinct communication channels. Each man would be shown a different destination account, number unknown to the others, meaning that whichever number was ultimately used to attempt the theft would immediately reveal which of them had acted and how the information had traveled. Wesley agreed to the plan, but just as they prepared to bring Vanessa into it, his phone lit up with an urgent alert, notifying him that someone had just accessed Darius's old federal case file. The search terms used were simple and direct. Darius Whitmore home, address a detail that turned their carefully constructed trap into something far more urgent and personal than either man had anticipated. Monica arranged a private meeting far from Sterling Meridian's headquarters inside an old records warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta, where Darius and Wesley were already waiting when Vanessa arrived. It was the first time she had seen him since the morning she fired him, and there were no conference tables here, no assistants hovering nearby, no titles separating them anymore. "I made a mistake," Vanessa said quietly, and Darius answered that she had made a decision, not a mistake. Without the evidence, she clarified, and he told her that the absence of evidence was exactly what had turned her decision into a mistake in the first place. Vanessa did not try to justify herself further, admitting openly that she had trusted Brett and Travis simply because of their titles, while she had looked at Darius and seen nothing more than an entry-level employee whose opinion carried little weight. Darius told her the real problem was never that she thought he was foolish, but that she had never considered him worth listening to at all, a distinction that landed heavily in the quiet warehouse air. He handed her the original 6 minutes of footage, and she watched in silence as Travis's reflection appeared clearly in the glass, followed by the whispered words about a 9-minute window that had haunted Darius since the night it happened. Vanessa realized in that moment that Darius had done far more than protect $31 million. He had stopped her from unknowingly signing her own name onto a crime that could have destroyed her career and her freedom both. When Darius laid out the plan involving the fabricated $44 million transaction, he explained that she would need to return to the company and behave as though nothing had changed, even publicly defending Brett if necessary, to keep suspicion away. Vanessa hesitated, uncomfortable with the deception required of her, but ultimately agreed to play her part. Back at Sterling Meridian, she called a leadership meeting and announced a new confidential transaction tied to the acquisition scheduled to move $44 million by Friday. As she spoke, she watched Brett glance toward Travis for barely half a second, a flicker she would once have dismissed entirely as meaningless. Now she understood that Darius had built an entire career noticing exactly these kinds of half-second moments that everyone else chose to ignore. Brett received documents referencing an account ending in 7714, while Travis was allowed to glimpse an account ending in 8826, and Colton was given a completely different number ending in 4931. With none of them aware, the others held different information. At 1:48 in the morning that Friday, a small test transfer of exactly $10 was sent to confirm the routing landing in the account, ending in 7714, confirming that Brett was the source of the leak. Almost immediately afterward, something unexpected happened. The surveillance cameras began looping again, 26 minutes earlier than anyone had anticipated in their carefully timed plan. Darius stared at the monitors, while Wesley asked whether the conspirators were actually moving, and Darius shook his head slowly, saying they weren't, that they somehow already knew this was a trap. At that exact moment, the entire 31st floor lost power completely, and Vanessa Holloway was still inside the building when it happened. Only the 31st floor had gone dark, with the building's emergency backup power failing to activate a detail that proved beyond doubt that someone had deliberately sabotaged the system from within. Darius no longer held any official position at Sterling Meridian and had no legal right to enter the building, and Wesley urged him to wait for a federal response team to arrive on scene. But Darius understood the layout of that tower better than anyone alive, and he knew Vanessa might already be under pressure somewhere inside to authenticate a transaction against her will. Monica used her audit credentials to grant him access through the technical service corridor, bypassing the main elevators entirely, and Darius climbed the service stairwell, instead counting the minutes, as he moved higher through the minutes. Darkened structure. Inside a blacked-out office on the 31st floor, Vanessa found herself face-to-face with Brett, who no longer bothered pretending innocence of any kind. He admitted the company had been quietly bleeding money for years, without detection funds buried inside layers of acquisition paperwork that no auditor had ever thought to question. He called it money. Nobody remembered. And when Vanessa asked why they needed exactly $31 million this particular time, Brett revealed that a foreign banking partner was closing their account, forcing them to extract whatever remained before the entire arrangement vanished. Travis appeared next, having already sealed the doors using his authority over the building's security systems rather than any weapon in hand. He locked Vanessa inside the office, since Brett needed her biometric authentication token to finalize the transaction, and Vanessa flatly refused to cooperate. Colton arrived shortly after, visibly frightened, aware that a federal investigation was already underway and desperate to withdraw from the entire scheme before it collapsed around him. Brett threatened to expose Colton's involvement in the previous 7 transactions if he tried to back out now, and the 3 men began turning on each other, while Vanessa quietly worked to stall for as much time as possible. Darius could not force his way through the sealed door on the 31st floor. But 14 months of nightly patrols had taught him something Travis himself had once dismissed as unimportant. The eastern fire door carried a mechanical delay of exactly 4.2 seconds after losing power, a flaw Travis had refused to fix because he considered it negligible. Darius manually cut the power himself, waited through those 4.2 seconds, and forced the door open just as he had calculated. Brett began entering the fraudulent transaction, and Darius found himself once again facing the same 6-minute window he had faced the night before. Except this time he chose not to sever the connection early. Wesley needed direct, undeniable evidence, so Darius allowed the transaction to run its full course while tracking every stage as it unfolded in real time. Vanessa deliberately pressed her finger onto the biometric scanner, exactly as instructed. The transaction confirmed, and Brett smiled as $44 million appeared to leave Sterling Meridian for good. Brett believed he had won right up until Darius stepped out from the shadows, and Brett's expression collapsed into stunned silence. $44 million never existed. Darius told him flatly, explaining that the entire transaction had taken place inside a simulated banking environment, fully controlled by federal investigators from the very beginning. Brett had just logged in, confirmed the transfer, selected the destination account, used a forged authentication token, and completed the entire sequence of criminal behavior on record for everyone to see. Wesley's team moved in immediately while Travis attempted desperately to wipe the system before Gavin remotely locked every administrative privilege from outside the building. Colton surrendered without resistance, offering no fight at all as agents took him into custody alongside the others. As officers led Brett away in handcuffs, he turned back toward Vanessa with a cold smile still on his face. "You think this started with me?" he said, and Vanessa said nothing in response. "Ask your board who approved the first transfer," he added, before he was pulled from the room entirely, leaving Vanessa standing beside Darius in stunned silence. The $31 million theft had been stopped, but the far larger conspiracy behind $186 million might have originated somewhere far closer to the top of the company than either of them had imagined, inside the very boardroom where Sterling Meridian's most trusted decisions were supposedly made. Wesley opened a formal, wide-reaching federal investigation soon after, and Monica turned over 36 months of financial records for full review. Vanessa asked Darius to join the investigation as a special consultant, and when he initially refused, she clarified that she was not asking him as his former employer. "Good," he replied, "because you're not." And after some consideration, he agreed, driven mostly by his own need to see the entire matter finally brought to a close. Investigators traced the $186.4 million through 7 transactions, 23 shell companies, and 11 separate bank accounts. Funds quietly returned to the company disguised as overvalued asset acquisition. Brett and Travis had only ever managed the technical execution of the scheme, while the true architects turned out to be a small interest group connected to two members of the company's own board of directors. These two board members never touched a single transaction directly, instead engineering what investigators called audit blind spots gaps deliberately built into company policy that allowed the fraud to continue undetected for years. Buried in records from 3 years earlier, Darius found an internal email requesting that video retention on the 31st floor to be reduced from 90 days down to just 30. A request originally proposed by Travis, financially approved by Brett. But the committee that had first pushed for that policy change traced directly back to the board itself, and Darius mapped the full timeline with growing clarity. The theft had never truly begun with a wire transfer at all. It had begun years earlier with a quiet, unremarkable change to a camera retention policy that nobody at the time had thought worth questioning. Vanessa was never implicated as a willing participant in the conspiracy, but she was forced to acknowledge before the board and federal investigators that she had signed off on policies without ever asking hard questions. She admitted she had focused too heavily on growth at the expense of oversight, and that she had helped build a culture where employees on the ground floor were never truly heard. Fraud doesn't survive because nobody sees it. Darius told the assembled board members plainly it survives because the people who see it are never considered important enough to matter. During a special session, the original 6 minutes of footage were played in full for every board member present, showing exactly how Darius had first detected the looped cameras, his call with Gavin, and the precise moment he isolated the network from outside access. A running clock beneath the footage revealed that had he hesitated only 73 more seconds, the original $31 million transfer would have completed successfully without interruption. The recording then shifted seamlessly into the footage of Vanessa firing him only hours later, and the room fell completely silent as everyone absorbed the weight of what they were watching. Vanessa did not ask for the footage to be stopped choosing, instead, to let every board member sit with it until the end. Brett was formally charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate identity theft, while Travis faced charges for unauthorized system access evidence tampering and conspiracy alongside him. Colton cooperated fully with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, while the two implicated board members resigned from their positions and became subjects of an ongoing separate investigation. More than $140 million in related assets were frozen pending recovery efforts, and Sterling Meridian braced itself for a period of significant internal restructuring in the months that followed. After the final hearing concluded, Vanessa placed a sealed envelope in front of Darius, containing a formal offer for the position of Chief Security and Risk Officer, with a salary nearly 12 times what he had earned as a night guard. Darius read the offer carefully from beginning to end, then tore the paper cleanly in half without a word of explanation. Vanessa sat frozen, unsure how to respond, but Darius made no move to leave the room just yet. "Now, let's discuss what the job is actually worth," he told her, and the conversation that followed would shape the company far more than any salary figure ever could. He explained plainly that he had no interest in being rewarded out of guilt, and no interest in becoming a headline about a security guard turned executive as some feel-good corporate story. If Vanessa genuinely understood the mistake she had made, he told her she needed to change the entire system that had allowed it to happen, not simply elevate one man's title as a gesture of atonement. Darius laid out 5 specific conditions before her, insisting that the security department operate fully independent from both the chief financial officer and general operations leadership going forward. Every employee, regardless of position, needed a direct channel to report anomalies straight to internal audit without interference from management above them. Any warning raised by frontline staff had to be documented formally in writing, with no executive permitted to quietly delete or reclassify a security incident ever again. Every financial incident exceeding $5 million would require a mandatory cross-reference against physical access data before being closed. Vanessa read through each condition, slowly recognizing quickly that this was not a request for compensation at all, but a blueprint designed specifically to prevent the exact conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the company from ever happening again. Darius added one final condition before she could respond, telling her simply that every executive in the building needed to learn the names of the people protecting it. Vanessa allowed herself a small, quiet smile, not because the statement was amusing, but because she understood exactly who it was aimed at. 6 months later, Sterling Meridian had undergone significant restructuring, with Vanessa still serving as chief executive officer, though now operating under considerably tighter oversight than before. Monica had been promoted to chief audit executive. Gavin now led an entirely new integrity systems division, and Darius accepted the newly created role of executive director of security, integrity, and financial threat response. He turned down the spacious office on the 37th floor, entirely choosing instead a small workspace beside the surveillance center, where he had once worked alone through countless quiet nights. One evening, as Vanessa left the building late, she paused beside a new security guard, standing quietly near the lobby entrance. She read his name tag carefully, greeted him by name, and asked how his shift had been going so far, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable for her only months earlier. Darius watched the exchange unfold on a nearby monitor, offering no dramatic reaction, only a slow, quiet nod of recognition. Later that night, Vanessa stopped by the surveillance office and asked him whether he ever wondered what might have happened had he waited for permission before acting. Darius glanced briefly at the system clock before answering that $31 million would have simply vanished without a trace. And Vanessa asked quietly, and Darius told her she might have spent years afterward trying to prove she hadn't stolen it herself. Vanessa sat with that answer in silence for a moment, before asking the question that had lingered in her mind since the night everything began: why he had chosen to act at all. "Because I saw it," Darius answered simply, and when she asked if it was really that straightforward, he told her that seeing something makes a person responsible for whatever they choose to do next. For 14 months, executives had walked past Darius Whitmore as though the uniform made him invisible, a fixture of the lobby rather than a man with a history and a mind sharper than most of theirs combined. Then, in just 6 minutes, the man they barely noticed protected $31 million, exposed a conspiracy worth $186 million, and quietly saved a chief executive from being framed by the weight of her own signature. Vanessa's greatest mistake was never firing Darius Whitmore in a moment of panic and pressure. It was deciding long before that morning that his position alone told her everything she needed to know about the value of his voice. Because sometimes the person standing closest to the door sees danger long before anyone sitting comfortably at the top of the building ever will. And by the time those at the top finally choose to look down and listen, 6 minutes may be all the time they have left to make it right.